about to experience The Last Calculation, an original short story from Set Free. Discover more captivating short stories at setfree.com. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story.
The fluorescent lights in Hartwell and Associates hummed their familiar tune as Jonathan Reeves adjusted his tie and stared at the spreadsheet that had consumed his morning. December 20th, 2012. Another day. Another column of numbers that needed to balance. The office buzzed with the usual pre-holiday chatter, punctuated by nervous laughter about the supposed Mayan apocalypse tomorrow. "You stocking up on canned goods, John?" Marcus called out from the neighboring cubicle, his voice carrying that forced joviality people adopted when discussing something that made them genuinely uncomfortable. Jonathan pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and managed a weak smile. "Right after I finish reconciling these quarterly reports." He had always found comfort in numbers. They were predictable, logical, immune to the chaos that seemed to govern everything else in life. Unlike his recent divorce, unlike the custody battle that had left him seeing his children every other weekend, unlike the persistent insomnia that had plagued him since September, the morning crawled by in its typical fashion until 11:47 a.m. when the first tremor hit. It wasn't the gentle swaying of a minor earthquake. The building groaned as if something massive had struck it from below, sending coffee cups cascading from desks and causing the ceiling tiles to rain down like oversized confetti. Jonathan gripped his desk as his monitor toppled forward, the screen going dark with a sound like breaking glass. What the hell was that? Marcus scrambled to his feet, his usually pristine shirt now coffee-stained and wrinkled. Before anyone could answer, the lights cut out. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the office look like the inside of a developing photograph. Then came the sound, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through Jonathan's very bones. "Everyone remain calm," their manager Patricia called out, though her voice betrayed her own fear. "I'm sure it's just a power grid issue. Let's evacuate in an orderly fashion." But as they made their way toward the stairwell, Jonathan glanced out the window and saw something that made his blood freeze. The sky had changed. What had been a typical overcast December morning was now a writhing mass of colors that had no names, hues that hurt to look at directly. And moving through those impossible colors were shapes, vast and serpentine, that seemed to bend space around them as they glided through the atmosphere. "Jesus Christ!" someone whispered behind him. "What are those things?" Jonathan couldn't answer. He couldn't even process what he was seeing. The shapes weren't aircraft, weren't anything that belonged in Earth's sky. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested intelligence, but an intelligence so alien that it made his mind recoil from the implications. The evacuation became a stampede. By the time Jonathan reached the street, chaos had consumed the city. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of intersections, their drivers having fled on foot. Store windows had been smashed, though whether by looters or by something else entirely wasn't clear. People ran in all directions, some screaming, others moving with the glazed expression of minds that had simply shut down when confronted with the impossible. And, everywhere, that sound. That deep, resonant hum that seemed to be growing stronger by the minute. Jonathan's phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife, Sarah. "Kids are terrified. Can't reach you. Are you safe?" He tried to call her back, but the call wouldn't connect. The cellular towers were either down or overwhelmed. He began walking toward his car, then remembered that his Honda was in the shop. The mechanic had promised it would be ready by Friday. Friday seemed like a lifetime away now. A man in a torn business suit grabbed Jonathan's arm. "You need to get to the subway tunnels," he said, his eyes wide with panic. "The government's setting up shelters underground. Away from those things." He pointed skyward without looking up. Jonathan nodded and let himself be pulled along with a growing crowd of refugees. They descended into the metro system, where the familiar smell of urine and stale air was now overlaid with something else. Something that reminded him of ozone and copper pennies. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the tiled walls. The platform was packed with hundreds of people, all talking at once, creating a din that competed with the omnipresent humming from above. Children cried, adults argued. Someone had brought a portable radio, and fragments of emergency broadcasts cut through the noise. Recommend all citizens seek immediate shelter. Unknown aerial phenomena confirmed over major metropolitan areas worldwide. Reports of coordinated attacks on military installations. Please remain calm while authorities assess the situation. Jonathan found a place against the wall and slid down to sit on the cold concrete. This couldn't be happening. The Mayan calendar thing was supposed to be a joke, something for doomsday preppers and conspiracy theorists to obsess over. He was an accountant. He lived in a world of quarterly reports and tax deadlines, not ancient prophecies and cosmic horror, but the evidence was all around him. The terrified faces, the impossible sky, the sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond the earth itself. Hours passed. The radio broadcasts became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The humming grew stronger, accompanied now by new sounds, a rhythmic thumping that might have been footsteps if the feet belonged to something the size of a building. Occasionally, the entire tunnel system would shake, sending dust cascading from the ceiling and causing people to cry out in fear. It was during one of these tremors that Jonathan first noticed the purple glow. A woman near the far end of the platform was arguing with a transit worker about something, her voice rising above the general din. But it wasn't her words that caught Jonathan's attention. It was her eyes. They glowed with a soft purple light, like colored contacts, but the illumination seemed to come from within. "We should go topside," she was saying. "We should welcome them. They've come to show us the truth." The transit worker backed away from her. "Lady, you need to sit down. You're not making sense." "I'm making perfect sense." Her voice had taken on a strange cadence, as if she were reciting something from memory. "The old world is ending. The new world is beginning. We must prepare ourselves for the transformation." Others had noticed her now. A small crowd was gathering, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. Jonathan found himself moving closer, drawn by a fascination he couldn't explain. "The stars are right," the woman continued. "The alignment is perfect. Our lords have awakened from their long slumber, and they call to us. Can't you hear them? Can't you feel their love?" As she spoke, Jonathan noticed that others in the crowd were nodding along, and their eyes, too, were beginning to glow with that same purple light. "This is insane," someone muttered. "We need to get away from these people." But the group of purple-eyed individuals was growing. They moved through the crowd with a strange unity of purpose, touching people, whispering to them. And wherever they went, more eyes began to glow. Jonathan backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever was happening up on the surface, it was affecting people down here too. Some kind of radiation, maybe, or airborne pathogen. He needed to find another way out. He was making his way toward a maintenance tunnel when he heard his name being called. "Jonathan Reeves?" He turned to see a woman in a lab coat, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face streaked with dirt and fatigue. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was an intensity in her gray eyes that spoke of fierce intelligence. "How do you know my name?" "I'm Dr. Nadia Thorne, formerly of the Brookhaven National Laboratory. We've been looking for you." "Looking for me? Why?" She glanced around nervously, then grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Not here. Too many ears. Come with me." She led him through a series of maintenance corridors that he didn't even know existed. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and the air was thick with the smell of metal and mold. Emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to avoid tripping over the various obstacles that littered their path. "Where are we going?" Jonathan asked. "Safe house, sort of." She paused at a heavy steel door and punched in a code on a numeric keypad. "I should warn you, what I'm about to show you is going to sound completely insane." The door opened to reveal a large chamber that had been converted into some kind of laboratory. Computer servers lined the walls, their cooling fans creating a white noise that partially masked the ever-present humming from above. Cables snaked across the floor like electronic ivy, connecting arrays of equipment that Jonathan couldn't begin to identify. 3 other people were hunched over various workstations, their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors. They looked up as Jonathan and Dr. Thorne entered. "This is him?" asked a man with a graying beard and thick glasses, his slight accent suggesting Eastern European origins. "The accountant? Dr. Dmitry Kovalchik, meet Jonathan Reeves." Dr. Thorne said. Jonathan, Dr. Kowalczyk is our theoretical physicist. The woman over there is Dr. Anasha Okafor, our computer systems specialist. And the gentleman trying to look invisible in the corner is Agent David Torres, formerly of the NSA. Torres stepped forward and extended his hand. He was a compact man with watchful eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested military training. Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming. I didn't really have a choice, Jonathan replied, shaking the offered hand. And I still don't understand why you were looking for me. Dr. Kowalczyk cleared his throat and gestured for Jonathan to sit in a nearby chair. His voice carried the careful precision of someone who had spent years explaining complex concepts to skeptical audiences. Mr. Reeves, before we continue, I need to ask you something that's going to sound very strange. Have you ever had the feeling that you don't quite belong? That your life has been somehow out of sync with the world around you? Jonathan frowned. What do you mean? Small things, discrepancies, times when your memories don't match official records, when people claim events happened differently than you remember them, a sense that you're observing your own life from the outside. The question hit closer to home than Jonathan cared to admit. There had been moments, stretches of time, when he felt like an actor playing a role he didn't fully understand. The divorce proceedings had been full of such moments, with Sarah claiming he'd said things he had no memory of saying, done things that seemed completely out of character. Everyone feels like that sometimes, he said carefully. Not everyone, Dr. Okafor interjected, looking up from her computer. Her Nigerian accent was crisp, each word carefully enunciated. We've been monitoring reality fluctuations for the past 18 months, documenting cases where individuals seem to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty. You're one of only 3 people we've identified who display consistent markers of dimensional displacement. Dimensional displacement? Dr. Kowalczyk leaned forward, his pale blue eyes intense behind his glasses. Mr. Reeves, are you familiar with quantum mechanics? I balance books for a living. The most advanced math I do involves calculating compound interest. Right. Well, let me try to put this in layman's terms. Kowalczyk pulled up another chair and sat down facing Jonathan. Reality isn't as stable as we like to think it is. There are multiple versions of our universe, infinite variations playing out simultaneously. Usually, these realities remain separate. But sometimes there's bleed-through. You're saying I'm from another dimension? Not exactly. We think you're from this dimension, but you've been affected by proximity to dimensional barriers. Think of it like radiation exposure, but instead of gamma rays, you've been exposed to quantum uncertainty. Agent Torres stepped forward. The entities that are currently reshaping our reality exist primarily in the spaces between dimensions. Their presence has been causing reality to become unstable, creating pockets where the normal rules don't apply. People like you are sensitive to these changes, and that makes me valuable. How? Dr. Thorne moved to a massive piece of equipment that dominated the center of the chamber. It looked like someone had crossed a particle accelerator with a pipe organ. All gleaming metal tubes and crackling electrical displays. Because you can survive dimensional travel, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and desperation. What's happening up there, what we're seeing in the sky, it's not an invasion in the traditional sense. It's more like an awakening. Entities that exist in dimensions adjacent to our own have been dormant for millennia, but something has triggered their return to active consciousness. The Mayan calendar ending wasn't just a coincidence, Kowalczyk added. It was a marker, a countdown to this moment. The entities are reshaping reality at a fundamental level. Conventional military response has been completely ineffective because these beings exist partially outside our normal space-time. Jonathan looked around at the 4 people who had apparently dedicated their lives to understanding this cosmic horror. And your solution is to run away? Not running, Dr. Okafor said, her fingers never pausing in their dance across her keyboard. Escaping. This device is a dimensional breach generator. If we can't save this reality, maybe we can find another one. Another reality? Parallel dimensions. Alternate versions of Earth, where these entities either never existed or never awakened. The mathematics are incredibly complex, but the principle is relatively simple. We open a hole in space-time and step through. Jonathan stared at the device. And you've tested this? We've sent probes through, and they've returned with data suggesting that viable alternate realities do exist, Dr. Thorne said. But we've never tested it on living subjects. The power requirements are enormous. We're tapping directly into a geothermal vent 2 miles below the city. Even so, we'll only have enough energy for a single attempt. How many people can it transport? 3, Kowalczyk said quietly. Maybe 4 if we're willing to risk catastrophic failure. And you want me to be one of them because I'm, what, dimensionally flexible? Agent Torres nodded grimly. According to our calculations, you don't exist in the alternate realities we've been monitoring. No record of your birth, no social security number, no digital footprint. You're a statistical anomaly. When someone travels between dimensions, there's always the risk of encountering their alternate self. 2 versions of the same person existing in the same reality can cause paradoxes, reality collapse. But you're unique. You can integrate into a new timeline without causing a dimensional breakdown. The implications were staggering. Jonathan thought about his life, about the sense of disconnection he'd always felt, the way people sometimes looked at him as if he were slightly out of focus. What about my family? My children? Dr. Thorne's expression softened. Jonathan, the communication networks are down. The entity's offspring are patrolling the skies. The purple-eyed cultists are hunting anyone who shows signs of resistance to the conversion process. Your family is either already converted or... She didn't need to finish the sentence. I need time to think about this. There is no time, Torres said urgently. The entities are getting stronger. Their influence is spreading. We estimate we have maybe 12 hours before the breach generator becomes inoperable. As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered, and a new sound joined the omnipresent humming. It was a voice, though not quite human. It spoke in harmonics, multiple tones layered on top of each other, forming words in a language that predated human speech. They're calling to their converts, Dr. Okafor said, her face pale. The final phase is beginning. Jonathan closed his eyes and tried to process everything he'd been told. His normal life, his routine existence as an accountant, seemed like a dream now. The divorce, the custody battles, the quarterly reports, all of it meaningless in the face of cosmic horror. But deep down, he knew they were right. He had always felt like an outsider in his own life, like someone playing a role he didn't fully understand. Maybe this was why. Maybe he had been preparing for this moment his entire existence. If I agree to this, he said slowly, what happens to everyone else? To the billions of people who can't escape? They become part of the new reality the entities are creating, Kowalczyk replied. Transformed, converted, integrated into a cosmic consciousness that spans dimensions. It's not necessarily death, but it's not human life as we understand it either. Jonathan thought about Sarah, about his children David and Emma, about the life he would be abandoning. Then he thought about the purple-eyed cultists spreading through the subway tunnels, about the impossible shapes moving through the twisted sky, about a world being reshaped by intelligences beyond human comprehension. How long do I have to decide? The calibration process takes 8 hours, Dr. Okafor said. We need to begin immediately if we're going to attempt the breach before the entities complete their transformation of local space-time. Jonathan looked around the chamber one more time, at the advanced equipment, at the desperate faces of the people who had made this terrible choice before him. Outside, reality was being rewritten by cosmic forces beyond imagination. Here, a small group of humans was preparing to abandon everything they'd ever known in hopes of finding a world where such horrors had never awakened. All right, he said finally, let's do it. The next several hours passed in a blur of final preparations and growing terror. Jonathan found himself assigned to help Dr. Okafor with the computer systems. Though his contribution was limited to following her precise instructions and trying not to interfere with the countless cables and connections that seemed to hold the entire operation together, the breach generator required incredibly precise calibration. Too little power and the dimensional barrier wouldn't open. Too much, and the resulting explosion would probably level several city blocks. Dr. Kowalczyk worked with the focused intensity of a man who knew that a single miscalculation would doom them all. Meanwhile, Agent Torres maintained watch at the various monitoring stations they'd positioned throughout the tunnel system. The reports he brought back were increasingly grim. The purple-eyed cultists were organized now, moving through the underground passages with military precision, searching for holdouts and resistors. They're 2 levels up and moving methodically downward, he reported during one of his brief returns to the chamber. I estimate we have 3 hours before they reach this section. The calibration will take at least 4 hours, Dr. Kowalczyk replied without looking up from his work. Then we need to buy ourselves some time. Torres disappeared into the maintenance tunnels, carrying a duffel bag full of improvised explosive devices. Jonathan tried not to think about what that meant, but the sound of distant explosions over the next hour made it clear that the agent was doing everything possible to slow their pursuers. As the hours crawled by, the sounds from above grew more intense. The humming had become a roar, punctuated by crashes and screams that echoed through the tunnel system. Occasionally, the entire chamber would shake as something massive moved overhead. "The entities are reshaping the surface," Dr. Thorne explained, noting Jonathan's worried expression, turning it into something more suitable for their physiology. "The process is violent." Dr. Okafor's computers showed feeds from hidden cameras throughout the city. What Jonathan saw on those screens would haunt him for the rest of his life. The familiar skyline had been twisted into impossible geometries. Buildings bent and flowed like liquid, their surfaces covered in organic-looking growth that pulsed with that same purple light. And moving through this transformed landscape were things that his mind refused to process. Shapes that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. "How long have you known?" Jonathan asked Dr. Kowalczyk during a brief break in the calibration process. "About the entities, I mean." "The first signs appeared about 2 years ago," Kowalczyk replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Unusual seismic activity, unexplained electromagnetic phenomena, reports of shared dreams featuring common imagery. We formed this team 6 months ago when it became clear that conventional science couldn't address the threat." "And the government just let you build this thing?" Agent Torres had returned, his face grim but determined. "The government doesn't know about this project. Officially, we're all dead, killed in various accidents that happened to coincide with our recruitment. Sometimes the best way to save the world is to disappear from it first." "The charges are set," he continued. "That should slow down the cultists, but not for long. How much more time do you need?" 2 hours for the final calibration sequence," Dr. Kowalczyk said. "Then another 30 minutes for the actual breach generation." "We don't have 2 hours." As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant explosions echoed through the tunnels, closer than before. The lights flickered more violently, and somewhere in the depths of the facility, an alarm began to wail. "They're through the outer perimeter," Torres said, checking his monitoring equipment. "Moving fast now. They know we're here." Dr. Okafor's fingers flew over her keyboard. "I'm accelerating the calibration process. It's risky, but we don't have a choice." The breach generator began to emit a high-pitched whine that competed with the alien roar from above. Electrical displays flickered to life around its circumference, showing readings that meant nothing to Jonathan but seemed to satisfy the scientists. "Dimensional barrier is thinning," Dr. Kowalczyk announced. "Parallel reality scan is... Dear God." "What?" Dr. Thorne leaned over his shoulder to look at the display. "The alternate reality we're targeting. It's 2017. 5 years in the future from our perspective." "Is that a problem?" "I don't know. The temporal displacement wasn't part of our original calculations. We could be creating a causality loop. Or worse, a temporal paradox." The sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels, much closer now. Jonathan could hear individual voices, the rhythmic chanting of the cultists growing louder by the minute. "Whatever the risks, we're out of time," Torres said. He was loading ammunition into an assault rifle that had materialized from somewhere in his seemingly endless collection of equipment. "The cultists are 1 level up and moving fast. And they're not alone anymore." "What do you mean?" "Some of the entity's offspring have joined them. Smaller ones, but still," he shuddered. "Still not something we want to face in a confined space." "Breach generation in 60 seconds, Dr. Okafor announced. The whine from the generator rose to an almost unbearable pitch. The air in the chamber began to shimmer, and Jonathan felt a strange tingling sensation across his skin. Reality seemed to be becoming unstable around them, as if the fundamental laws of physics were being negotiated rather than enforced. "I'm detecting multiple viable realities," Dr. Kowalczyk said, his voice strained with concentration. "But I can only lock onto one target. The temporal displacement seems to be consistent across all of them. We're looking at arriving in 2017, regardless of which reality we choose." "Just pick one," Dr. Thorne said. A new sound joined the chaos. The rhythmic chanting of the cultists, their voices carrying that same harmonic quality as the entities themselves, but now underscored by something else. Something that sounded like wet, sliding movement and the scrape of things that weren't quite solid against the tunnel walls. "Breach generation in 30 seconds, Dr. Okafor said. "Everyone needs to be in position." Jonathan found himself standing between Dr. Thorne and Dr. Kowalczyk, facing a section of empty air that had begun to fold in on itself like origami made of light. The sight made his eyes water and his mind ache, but he couldn't look away. 20 seconds. The chanting was right outside the chamber now. Jonathan could hear individual voices, human voices twisted by whatever force had claimed them, calling out in languages that predated civilization. The purple glow was seeping under the chamber door, and with it came the smell of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. 10 seconds. The door began to buckle. Through the widening gap, Jonathan caught a glimpse of purple eyes and something else, something that his mind refused to process completely. Tentacles, maybe, or appendages that existed in too many dimensions to properly perceive. 5 seconds. Reality began to tear. Breach opening. The world split open like a piece of fabric, revealing something that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light. It was a hole in existence itself, a gateway to somewhere else entirely. Looking at it was like trying to focus on something that existed in too many dimensions at once. Go, go, go! Dr. Kowalczyk stepped through first, disappearing into the impossible aperture as if he'd never existed. Dr. Thorne followed, then Torres, then Dr. Okafor. Jonathan stood at the threshold, staring into the void between realities. Behind him, he could hear the chamber door finally giving way, the sound of rushing footsteps and that wet, sliding movement of things that shouldn't exist. The purple glow was getting brighter, and the chanting had risen to a fever pitch. He thought of his children, of Sarah, of the life he was leaving behind. Then, as something with too many angles and impossible geometry began to squeeze through the doorway behind him, Jonathan Reeves stepped forward into the space between worlds. The last thing he heard before reality collapsed around him was the sound of his own scream, though whether it was from terror or from the indescribable sensation of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, he would never know. The transition was indescribable. For a moment that lasted forever, Jonathan existed in a state of pure possibility, experiencing every potential version of himself that had ever existed or could exist. He was a doctor, a teacher, a homeless man, a millionaire, a father, a bachelor, a hero, a coward. He was everything and nothing, stretched across infinite realities like consciousness scraped over too much existence. Then he was falling, tumbling through normal space onto solid ground that felt like concrete but looked like grass. The sky above him was blue, normal blue, with white clouds and a sun that didn't hurt to look at. He lay there for a long moment, just breathing air that didn't taste of ozone and copper. Jonathan, can you hear me?" Dr. Thorne was kneeling beside him, her auburn hair disheveled, her face creased with concern and exhaustion. "We made it. We're through." He sat up slowly, his body aching as if he'd been hit by a truck. They were in what looked like a public park, surrounded by trees and walking paths and benches where people might sit on a pleasant afternoon. In the distance, he could see the familiar skyline of the city, but it was wrong somehow. The buildings were the same, but different. Newer in some cases, older in others. Construction cranes dotted the horizon where he remembered completed structures. Where are the others? Dr. Thorne's expression darkened. She gestured toward two figures sitting on a nearby bench. They were staring straight ahead with empty eyes, their mouths hanging open, drool running down their chins. One of them, Dr. Kowalczyk, was making a low, keening sound, like wind through an empty house. "The transition was too much for them," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Their minds couldn't handle the dimensional displacement. The human brain isn't designed to experience multiple realities simultaneously. They're gone." "And Torres?" "I don't know. He went through before us, but he's not here. Either he didn't make it, or he landed somewhere else. The breach wasn't perfectly stable at the end." Jonathan struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady. The grass beneath him felt real enough, and the warmth of the sun on his face was reassuring after the artificial lighting of the underground laboratory. But there was something subtly wrong about everything, as if the entire world had been shifted slightly out of focus. "So it's just us. It's just us." They spent the next several hours exploring their new reality, trying to understand what had changed, and what had remained the same. The year was indeed 2017, 5 years after the date they'd left behind. But this was a 2017 where the Mayan apocalypse had never happened, where the ancient entities had never awakened, where people walked around with normal colored eyes and worried about mundane things like traffic and taxes. It was paradise. It was also a constant reminder of everything they'd lost. The first challenge was immediate and practical. They had no identification, no documentation, no legitimate way to explain their existence. The clothes on their backs and the knowledge in their heads were all they possessed. Dr. Thorne adapted faster than Jonathan expected. Within days, she'd made contact with academic circles, using her expertise in theoretical physics and her intimate knowledge of cutting-edge research to secure temporary consulting positions. The advantage of being a scientist, she explained during one of their meetings at a small diner on the outskirts of town, is that knowledge is portable. I can publish papers, attend conferences, gradually rebuild my credentials. The scientific community here is only about 6 months behind where we were in our original timeline. Jonathan's situation was more problematic. His alternate self didn't exist in this reality, which was simultaneously a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant he could create a new identity without worrying about paradoxes. On the other hand, it meant starting completely from scratch, with no documentation, no history, no legitimate way to explain his existence. He spent the first few months living as a ghost, taking cash jobs, washing dishes, cleaning offices, doing manual labor for contractors who didn't ask too many questions. He slept in shelters, used public libraries for internet access, and slowly accumulated the resources he needed to build a new life. It was during this time that he began to understand the true cost of their escape. The other reality, the one they'd fled, hadn't been destroyed. It had been transformed. And sometimes, in quiet moments, Jonathan could still feel the pull of those cosmic entities, like a distant radio signal at the edge of perception. Dr. Thorne felt it too, though neither of them spoke about it directly. "I've been having dreams," she admitted during one of their weekly meetings, about 3 months after their arrival. "About the laboratory, about what we left behind." "What kind of dreams?" Dr. Kowalczyk and Dr. Okafor are still there in the chamber. "But they're not damaged anymore. They're speaking in harmonics like the entities. They keep calling to me, telling me to come home." Jonathan had been having similar dreams, though his featured Sarah and his children. In the dreams, they welcomed him back with purple eyes and voices that carried impossible undertones. They promised him peace, understanding, a place in the new cosmic order. "Do you think they're real? The dreams, I mean." "I think the entities exist outside normal space-time," Dr. Thorne replied. "I think they can reach across dimensional barriers, especially to people who've been exposed to their influence. We may have escaped physically, but psychologically." She didn't finish the sentence, but Jonathan understood. They were refugees from a cosmic horror, but they carried pieces of that horror within them. It was Dr. Thorne who finally provided Jonathan with the solution to his identity problem, 6 months after their arrival. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said. They were sitting in the same diner where they'd had their first conversation about adaptation. "You need to find this reality's version of your ex-wife." "Sarah doesn't exist here either," Jonathan replied. "I already checked." "Not Sarah. Someone who fills the same role in your life. Someone who knew a Jonathan Reeves, who should have existed but didn't. A wife, a girlfriend. Someone close enough to your alternate self to provide you with a legitimate backstory." It took months of careful research, but Jonathan eventually found her. Rebecca Martinez, a woman who had been married to a man named Jonathan Reed, an accountant who had died in a car accident in 2015. She was still grieving, still struggling with the financial and emotional aftermath of sudden loss. Rebecca was 34, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that reminded Jonathan painfully of Sarah. She worked as a high school mathematics teacher and lived alone in a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Her husband's death had left her financially stable but emotionally adrift. Jonathan approached her carefully, presenting himself as a distant relative of her deceased husband, someone who had fallen out of touch with the family years ago and was now trying to reconnect. It was a delicate deception, requiring him to learn details about a life he'd never lived, to study photographs and documents, to construct a believable personal history. The process was emotionally exhausting. Jonathan found himself grieving for a man he'd never met, A version of himself who had lived and died in this reality without ever knowing about dimensional barriers or cosmic entities. Jonathan Reed had been a simple man with simple pleasures: weekend barbecues, fantasy football leagues, annual camping trips with his wife. He'd died, never knowing that other realities existed, never experiencing the terror of watching the sky split open to reveal impossible geometries. "You remind me of him," Rebecca said during one of their early conversations. They were sitting in her living room, surrounded by photographs of her dead husband. "Not physically, but there's something about the way you think about numbers, about patterns. Jonathan always said that mathematics was the only thing in the world that made perfect sense." "I know what he meant," Jonathan replied, though he was thinking about how numbers had provided no comfort when reality itself had become unreliable. Rebecca was kind, intelligent, and desperately lonely. When Jonathan suggested that he could help her with the financial planning she'd been avoiding since her husband's death, she was grateful for the assistance. When he offered to stay in the spare bedroom temporarily while he got back on his feet, she agreed. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, but weeks stretched into months. Jonathan helped Rebecca organize her finances, updated her insurance policies, assisted with home repairs that she'd been putting off. In return, she provided him with stability, documentation, and gradually a legitimate identity. Within a year, they were married. It was a relationship built on lies, but it was also genuine in its own way. Jonathan cared for Rebecca, and she provided him with the anchor he needed to exist in this reality. They were both trying to rebuild their lives after devastating losses, and they found comfort in each other's company. Rebecca never questioned the gaps in his personal history, the way he sometimes seemed unfamiliar with pop culture references or political events from before 2012. She attributed his occasional disconnection to trauma, to the same kind of grief that had been consuming her since her first husband's death. "We're both ghosts," she said one evening, about 6 months into their marriage. They were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Living in the shadows of the people we used to be." She had no idea how literally true that statement was. The children came 2 years later. Twins, David and Emma, who looked nothing like the children Jonathan had lost in his original reality, but who filled the same hole in his heart. He was a good father, attentive and loving, though Rebecca sometimes commented on how he seemed to be trying to make up for some unspecified failure from his past. "You don't have to be perfect," she told him one night, after he'd spent 2 hours helping 5-year-old Emma with a school project that should have taken 20 minutes. "They love you just as you are." But Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a stolen life, inhabiting a role that should have belonged to someone else. The original Jonathan Reed had been buried in Greenwood Cemetery in 2015. Sometimes, Jonathan would visit the grave, staring at the headstone that bore his name and wondering what conversations he was supposed to be having with a dead man. Dr. Thorne remained in contact, but their relationship became increasingly strained as the years passed. She threw herself into her research, publishing papers on theoretical physics that danced around the edges of dimensional theory without ever revealing the truth of their origin. She secured a position at the university, acquired a small apartment near campus, and built a new life with the methodical precision of someone following a scientific protocol. But she never married, never formed close relationships, never seemed to fully commit to the reality they now inhabited. During their monthly meetings, she would update Jonathan on her work, on her attempts to detect signs of dimensional instability, on her growing conviction that their escape had been temporary at best. "I've been monitoring seismic data," she said during one of their meetings in 2020, 3 years after their arrival. "There are patterns, subtle fluctuations that match what we observed in our original timeline 6 months before the awakening." "You think it's starting again?" "I think it never stopped. The entities exist outside normal causality. From their perspective, all realities are simultaneous. They've been working to breach the barriers between dimensions for eons. What we experienced wasn't unique to our timeline." Jonathan thought about his dreams, which had become more frequent and more vivid over the years. In them, his original children called to him from across the dimensional divide, their voices carrying harmonics that made his bones ache with longing. "Sometimes I wonder if we made the right choice," Dr. Thorne continued. "Running away, abandoning our reality to save ourselves. Maybe we should have stayed and fought." "Fought with what?" "You saw what those things were capable of. They were reshaping reality itself." I know we didn't have a choice. But I can't shake the feeling that we're living borrowed time, inhabiting a world that was never meant to be ours. Jonathan thought about Rebecca, about David and Emma, about the life he'd built on a foundation of necessary deceptions. Maybe that's true, but it's the only world we have now. Is it, though? Dr. Thorne leaned forward, her gray eyes intense. I've been developing new theoretical models, ways to detect dimensional intrusion before it becomes visible. The mathematics suggest that the entities don't just transform realities, they collect them, like a cosmic librarian gathering every possible version of existence. What does that mean for us? It means we may not have escaped at all. We may have just moved from one collection to another. Their conversations always ended this way, with more questions than answers, with the growing suspicion that their refuge was temporary at best. Jonathan would return home to Rebecca and the children, to homework help and family dinners and all the mundane rituals of domestic life. But increasingly he found himself checking his reflection in windows and mirrors, looking for signs of the purple glow that had marked the converted in their original timeline. It was a Saturday afternoon in late summer 2022, exactly 10 years after the original awakening, when Jonathan finally understood what Dr. Thorne had been trying to tell him. He was sitting on the back porch, watching David and Emma play in the yard. They were 10 now, old enough to run and climb and explore with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. Rebecca was inside, preparing dinner and listening to music on the radio. It should have been a perfect domestic scene, the kind of moment that filled him with contentment. Instead, Jonathan found himself thinking about the reality he'd left behind, about the children who had been his before Rebecca's children, about the life that had been erased by cosmic horror. As he watched David chase Emma around the old oak tree that dominated their backyard, he began to notice something strange about the light. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, and the air itself had taken on a subtle shimmer, like heat rising from summer pavement. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, but the distortion remained. If anything, it was getting stronger. And then he heard it, faint at first, almost inaudible beneath the sounds of children's laughter and distant traffic. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before, in another reality, in another life. The sound of entities stirring, of dimensional barriers weakening, of ancient powers awakening from their slumber. "No," he whispered. "Not here. Not again." But even as he spoke, he could feel something changing inside him. A warmth spreading through his chest, a tingling sensation behind his eyes. He stumbled to his feet, reaching for the porch railing to steady himself, and caught sight of his reflection in the sliding glass door. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then the light shifted, and he saw what he'd been dreading for 10 years. His eyes were beginning to glow with a soft purple light. "Daddy?" Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Daddy, are you okay?" Jonathan turned toward his daughter, and the world transformed around him. He could see the connections now, the invisible threads that linked all things, the cosmic web that stretched across dimensions and realities. The entities had never been limited to a single universe. They existed in the spaces between worlds, in the quantum foam that underlay all existence. And they had been waiting. "Daddy's fine, sweetheart," he heard himself saying, though his voice sounded strange, harmonically layered in a way that made the words resonate with impossible authority. "Keep playing. Everything is going to be wonderful." Emma smiled and returned to her game, but Jonathan could see the purple glow beginning to flicker behind her eyes as well. David, too. The influence was spreading, just as it had before, but more subtly this time. More carefully, the entities had learned from their previous awakening. They understood now that a violent emergence would only create resistance, chaos, panic. Better to work slowly, to convert their chosen servants one by one, to reshape reality from within rather than imposing change from without. Jonathan walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the neighborhood. In the growing twilight, he could see other families in other yards, other children playing other games. And in the windows of distant houses, he could detect the faint purple glow that marked the beginning of a new age. He should have been terrified. Some part of him, the part that still remembered being human, was screaming in horror at what he was becoming. But that voice was growing quieter, overwhelmed by a sense of cosmic purpose that made his previous concerns seem petty and small. His phone buzzed, a text message from Dr. Thorne. Are you seeing this? The readings are off the charts. It's happening again. Jonathan looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Dr. Thorne would understand soon enough. They all would. Behind him, the sliding door opened, and Rebecca stepped onto the porch. "Dinner's ready," she said. Then she paused, studying his face in the dim light. "Jonathan, your eyes." He turned toward her, and she saw the purple glow that had claimed him. For a moment, fear flickered across her features. Then understanding dawned, and with it, acceptance. The light spread to her eyes as well, and she smiled with an expression of profound peace. "The children," she said softly, "are perfect," Jonathan replied. "Everything is perfect." In the distance, the sound of sirens began to wail. But they were not sounds of alarm or emergency. They were calls of celebration, of welcome, of transformation. The new world was announcing itself to those who had ears to hear. Jonathan put his arm around Rebecca, and together they watched their children play in the gathering darkness. Their young voices raised in laughter that contained harmonics of joy beyond human comprehension. 10 years. 10 years he'd lived in this borrowed reality, believing he'd escaped the cosmic entities that had consumed his original world. But there was no escape from beings that existed outside space and time, no hiding from intelligences that could reach across dimensional barriers as easily as stepping from one room to another. The last calculation had been completed, the final balance had been achieved, and in the space between realities, ancient entities smiled with something that might have been satisfaction, if satisfaction were a concept that applied to beings of infinite patience and cosmic scope. The game was beginning again, and this time, they would not be stopped.